Okay, it works. Very well. So the topic of this talk will be the problem-solving approach applied to HEMA. So basically, it's, I would say, not exactly a new approach because it's applied in many combat sports, implicitly or explicitly. But the goal is pretty much to think about the way we practice HEMA and how we can structure a curriculum around this practice in order to train people from a very practical point of view. So let's go. So what is HEMA in the first place? So we could say that it's a loose collection of modern activities based around old fighting books. So we could say that translating sources or working on an interpretation or free sparring are all part of HEMA. But to which extent and how could you define your day-to-day practice of HEMA? So basically, we have two things to do. First, we must pretty much base our practice around these old fighting books. But on the other hand, we need to make a weekly or daily practice that makes sense. So how can we organize that? So one of my hypotheses when I work with a source was that that source was made for actually fencing. And by fencing, I mean how to prevail in a fight between two uncooperative opponents. So uncooperative to some extent because it could be still in a sport setting or there could be some social conventions, but still there is a form of struggle, I would say, between two people. So one thing is that it may not be true for all sources. This is not necessarily true. Like maybe some sources are only meant to preserve a tradition and were not linked to an actual fencing practice. Maybe they are, I don't know, a theoretical experiment. So as an example, it could be the case of Agrippa's treatise, which was really influential, but Agrippa wasn't a fencing master. He was actually an architect, and we don't really know how practical his stuff really was, okay? So anyway, we want to basically fight. So if the sources were meant to describe how to prevail in some form of free fight, free to some extent, then we may try to do the same thing during our modern practice. So we would train HEMA as a modern combat sport with an emphasis on fencing, on sparring. So basically, we really need to focus on the act of fencing and not on just on the book, okay? The two things are needed, but we need to work on both, okay? So next, what would I say? So basically, we have a bit of the common HEMA dilemma, which is should we practice a historical martial art or fence well? Basically, as instructors, we would like our students to do both. We would like to make a real, we would like our sparring to be inspired by the sources and look like what we expect an ancient fight to look like, I would say, one way or another. And on the other hand, we want just to prevail on the opponent no matter what. We want our students to be able to win a fight. And basically, it's a dilemma that is not really easy to solve. And the first issue is that we want our students to fence well, but what is good fencing in the first place? So would you say that, I don't know, a modern saber is good Lichtenauer fencing, or is Kendo good fencing according to Salvatore Fabris? It's not obvious. So you probably need objective criteria the whole club could agree on and assess in order to define what is good fencing. You need to define it properly. So in order to define good fencing, you will need, in your day-to-day practice, a fencing convention. It's impossible to learn good fencing if you don't even define good fencing in the first place. Here, your students are left to their own mean when it comes to interpreting the result of a bout. So you need to design a fencing convention. And when you design such a convention, there are a few criteria you should take care of. I would say the first one is, what is a hit? So obviously, if we fence, we probably want to hit or to score an action against the opponent. It may not even be a physical hit. You may consider that stress is enough, but we want to be able to score a hit. And you must define what is a hit in the first place. So what are the legal targets? What are the allowed techniques? Does hit quality matter? So maybe edge alignment, maybe some form of chambering of the blow, maybe you want the blade to flex. So there are many requirements, but pretty much you must be able to say, is it a hit or not? So another criteria would be, when should an exchange end? So you may define a lockout time, which is what is used often in modern fencing, which is after the first hit, there is a small time frame during which other hits are still registered, and then it's over. The exchange stops, and you attribute some points. So you may obviously use the common afterblow rules that many HEMA rule sets do. You may try some continuous sparring. You may stop the exchange when someone is running off the boundaries. So it's very important to set up some boundaries while you fence. Otherwise, some people can just keep running away, which doesn't make much sense. So basically, you need to be able, so when do we hit and when does this exchange end? And the next criteria would be, how do I win an exchange? So you know that the exchange will the exchange will end when some hits have been scored after a given time frame. But then, who wins this exchange? It is not necessarily obvious, and it may depend on your rule set. So you need to define some way to determine the winner of this exchange, depending on what happened. So basically, if there are some double hits, you need to be able to handle them. Maybe you may want your fencers to perform a mandatory retreat after eating. Maybe you could introduce weighted targets, so some targets are more valuable than others. But basically, you need to be able to tell, okay, who won the exchange and what did he win? Okay, what was the winner of this exchange? And obviously, you may consider the winner of a whole match during a tournament, but you don't really need to consider that. But at the very least, you need to be able to assess, when is an exchange successful? How can you win an exchange? So you need a fencing convention, but we're doing HEMA after all, so you want it to be historical. And in order to be historical, it must be inspired by the sources you study. So when we look for an historical convention, the first place we should consider is obviously the historical rule sets. Like, if there is an obvious historical rule set that matches your source, it should be pretty much your reference point, I would say. You may not obviously reproduce it exactly if you consider that it may be unsafe, and as an example, some safety gear would be welcome. But it should be basically still one of the way you train. Basically, if it was good enough for the people who wrote the book, it should be at the very least interesting for you to practice. So another thing to consider is what is the social background of the sources you study. So there may be some forms of social conventions that make some action illegal, maybe in the most literal sense. So we can consider obviously thrust in a sport fencing contest as far as maybe sport longsword fencing is concerned as an example, but it's hardly the only rule. So there may be a social taboo against retreating. So there are many things to consider. Basically, a fight is not a free-for-all. It's not basically anything goes. There are some constraints, and you need to understand what were the constraints, explicit and implicit, that bounded this fight. So one thing to consider is the period fencing gear as well, or maybe the armor worn. Like if some places are expected to be armored, some cuts may be not that efficient or just not really useful. So as an example, there aren't many cuts to the torso in Fiore, and maybe it's because people were wearing heavy jackets and it would prevent such cuts. So there are no obvious answers about that, but it's still very useful to know. So using only the source. So if you don't have the social context of a source, because it's not always an easy thing to find, you may use the source itself as the basis for your rule set. So as an example, you may look for the favored blows and targets. So if the head is targeted first and foremost, then maybe you should make head strikes more valuable, or maybe if you're being told to target the hands, then hand sniping should be valuable. So there are many ways to define what is a good or a bad blow. Maybe, as an example, flat hits should not be allowed. So basically, still, you can learn a lot of things from the source itself to design your own rule set. And the last consideration is tactical. So as far as decision making is concerned, are some actions deemed more valuable than others? So an example would be attacking first in Lichtenauer's framework, which is deemed better to be in the Wort, in the Nach. Okay, so the point of this rule is that your student should later be able to judge every exchange according to this convention. Because in order to learn, you need to be able to assess your own performance. So did I fence well, or do I fence well, or was it a poor exchange? And if I cannot do that, then I cannot learn. It's impossible to get feedback. So the most elementary feedback you need is this fencing convention, and it is better if it is judged by a third person. So your students should be able to judge their own performance, but also the performance of others. So before defining a curriculum, before defining your own class, in order to base your fencing practice on something that can be easily understood and shared by all the members of a club, you need to define this fencing convention. This is really the first step. So now that you have a fencing convention, you may want to teach fencing, because that's pretty much your deal here. It's about you're doing a combat sport, and I expect you to be able to teach it if you're an instructor. So how do we do that? So the typical HEMA lesson would be the following sequence. So first, we introduce an excerpt from a historical source. So it may be a Stucke, a play, whatever the name you give to a single technique, but it's often used this way. So a single tactical or technical concept. Then next, you interpret this technique or concept. So it may be done beforehand by the instructor only, or the interpretation may be performed during the class. It depends on the groups, and it could be one way or another. It doesn't matter. The next is that you will perform this technique in compliant drills. So the students are working together to just create the right choreography, I would say. Next, you turn these drills into competitive games to make sure that your interpretation is correct, that it's reliable, that it's practical and can be used while you fence. And next, you spar in order to apply these concepts, to apply this new technique during your fencing practice. So this is really the most common HEMA class. And the issue with this framework, I would say, is that your students must be dealing with two competing goals, which is when I fence, should I apply the technique I learned or should I win the match? And obviously, under pressure, people will just drop whatever they learned and will focus on winning the match. Because if your only focus is to apply the technique and you don't care about losing, that is very easy. You can apply the technique like a robot, you will lose every exchange, but technically you apply the technique. Not successfully, but you applied it. But basically, if you need to win the match and apply the technique, it's a very hard thing to balance. Maybe a more experienced student can do that because they know, like, I'm fencing a beginner, I know that I will win. So I will focus on something that is more situational for me and will make a better challenge. But from two beginners sparring together, they will try to do the hardest to win. You want them to try the hardest. Pretty movement won't make them win. And we're still doing a combat sport. We're still focusing on a form of efficiency while sparring. So the conundrum here is that for your students, the techniques or concepts you introduced are a constraint. Then at the very least, they may end up being perceived as so, because basically it's not it's an additional constraint over the fact that you should fence well. So first constraint is fence well. Second constraint is, okay, you must fence well, but you must also apply this technique. So it's a bit of a mess, and you will sooner or later drop off one of these two goals. So the cause of this problem is that we are trying to shoehorn a technique into a fight. So basically, if our goal is to fight well, then we cannot start with the technique first. If you bring the technique first, you implicitly mean that the technique is what matters, and the fight is a mere secondary application of this technique. So the solution to this problem is to emphasize fighting. And by emphasizing, I mean starting from the fight and developing your curriculum, developing your teaching from there. So I would call this paradigm, this framework, the problem-solving approach. So it's not really new. It has been used in many combat sports, and pretty much it follows these steps. So first, you need to identify concrete fencing problems your students are dealing with. And in order to identify them, the best way is obviously to watch your students spar and see what are their issues, what are they dealing with. Next, once you have identified the issues, you need to find answers to these problems, and the more historical the answer, the better. So basically, you need to find I would say, the right technique or the right concept for the right problem. So you're still using the source because we're doing HEMA, but you use it as a way to solve the problems the student face. So the new technical and tactical concepts should be helpful to the student. And you iterate this approach until you move to the next problem. So once the initial problem is fixed, then you try to fix another problem. So it's pretty much whack-a-mole but with fencing concepts, I would say, with fencing classes. So the target group of this approach will be beginners and intermediate students during group classes. So there are two problems here. The first is that, obviously, next step, these students need to have enough protective gear to spar. So basically, if you cannot spar, it's really hard to detect problems. You may not know what are the actual problems your students are facing. So maybe you may overemphasize the small form issues that wouldn't make a big difference while sparring, while ignoring a huge tactical issue one of your beginners may be facing. So you need enough protective gear to spar. If you cannot spar, you cannot assess the problems, and it doesn't make the problem-solving approach very efficient. So you need enough protective gear. And last point, so it's not for advanced students. So what are the two issues here? The first is that individual lessons are very different. So there are pretty much two ways to teach. Either an instructor is handling a big class of, I don't know, 10, 20 people, perhaps even more. Let's say more than 5 people. Or a student, the teacher is only teaching one student at a time, and the other students are fencing meanwhile. So these are the two most common approach. And unlike group classes, individual lessons can be tailored, and actually must be tailored to the different people. So different lessons for different people, and you may, a good teacher may improvise a lot of exercises, a lot of interesting things during an individual lesson, but it's a fairly different framework, okay? When you teach an individual lesson, you need to be very reactive, being able to improvise exercises, being able to spot issues and find a way to correct them. I would say a group class is maybe a bit more structured and a bit different. And yeah, the next problem is that we want to teach, let's say, beginners and intermediate students, because your advanced students know the techniques. So with them, you don't need to introduce brand new concepts. They already know them, but they may need to refine some mechanics, at which point you may introduce some fine biomechanical tuning. And it is, I would think it is better done with individual lessons. And fence, if you're an advanced student, maybe it's better to fence a lot and then do very focused drill on your own issues. But we'll talk about that later. So our target group, it's basically a class of beginners or intermediate students with enough protective gear. So that's why I like Foam's word. You're pretty sure anyone can spar using this word. And I think you shouldn't spar too early, but early competitive games are a good thing. At the very least, if not free sparring, at least restrained sparring. So once you know the people you're teaching, you want to deal with 3 problems. I would say there are 2 ways, There are 2 ways to solve a problem. So it may be the technical way, which is pretty much you are facing a problem and I will introduce a new technique that will solve this problem. And the tactical way, it's quite different, is that given the current tools you master, so given your current style, given your current technical proficiency, how can you win? How can you do the job? So how can you tailor your fencing to your what would be Harmenberg term, your proficiency zone, I would say. So basically how to apply your skills. So learn a new skill or apply these skills. So first, I may discuss the technical answer because it's still very useful. And if you're teaching beginners, you may use it a lot, actually. So you may enjoy these monkeys in the meantime. So when you want to teach a technique, I would say that you need to deal with 3 steps. The first step is first to go through the motions, so the how. The second is to learn when you should or should not use the techniques. So what is the right stimulus? What is the proper input you need in order to make the techniques succeed? And the last is, I would say, the where, but it's a bit not that a good term, but I wanted to have 3 questions. And it's learn to set up the technique. So how can you create a favorable situation to apply this technique? So I will discuss each of these 3 steps. So I think the how is best learned with very simple technical drills. So basically, so something that is very important, in my opinion, is that when you do a technical drill, you should avoid realistic choreography. And by realistic, I mean trying to simulate a fencing exchange. You don't want to make something when, okay, fencer A will attack and fencer B will parry this attack and then perform the right technique. So this is not something that is, in my opinion, that leads to proper fencing, because you cannot, and this is fairly, it may not be obvious, but you cannot isolate a whole motion, a whole answer from its context, from its tactical context, from its technical context, from its, I would say, even emotional context. So emotion is an answer to something in a given context, and it's what makes the move realistic is not even the move itself, but I would argue it is the context it is performed in. So if you need to perform a technique very quickly under a lot of stress, then the choreography doesn't make much sense. So that's why I would argue you should rather focus on very, very simple motions. And if you're introducing a new technique, then you should focus on the new motions first and ignore the rest. So I don't know if you need to, perform winding at the sword. So in the German longsword system, maybe you need to just learn these winding motions against a steel sword. Again, a very static long point with no position at all, no cut, no thrust, just winding, because you need to isolate these new motions. Otherwise, you may end up like dealing with two issues at once if one of the motions your student is using is not properly performed. So you need to be able to isolate the issue and learn it in a kind of black box, I would say. So the next step is obviously to make sure that the instructions of the technical drills are performed. So by technical drill, I mean something when two students are cooperating and the goal is to perform some motions. So the instructions must be very clear. So this is often the big issue with technical drills, and that's why I want to avoid choreography, which is that the feedback is not right. The feedback is wrong because, the feed is not right because the context is missing. Like pretty much, as an example, the attacker may be striking to miss, and in that case, it doesn't make much sense. Maybe the attack will be too slow, or aim for the wrong part, or thrown from too far away, but the right stimulus won't be there, the right context won't be there. So make the instruction clear so that even the most, I would say, the newest member can perform the drill. So make the motion clear and avoid any implicit motions that may be harder to perform. So when you describe the technique, and it's a very hard part, I would argue that it is better to use a simple effect-oriented cues. So by effect-oriented, I mean that you should describe the motion not in terms of muscular patterns. So don't say you need to move your shoulder this way, or you need to move your elbow this way, you need to use a muscle A or muscle B. You should avoid that because first, it's very hard to apply these, I would say, these low-level patterns. You need to have a very good kinesthetic sense in order to understand these instructions. And another is that we're all different, and we may feel a technique differently. So as an example, in my club, we're two instructors, and we describe the same technique using like very different cues. Like I would focus on the shoulder, whereas like I would say send the shoulder forward, whereas the other instructor would say that, okay, now you must sit in the hip. You must like let your hip sit back, and we were performing the very same move, but we described it and we probably felt it differently. So you should rather use effect-oriented cues, and by effect I mean like describe your action in terms of pulling, pushing, tiering. Maybe use some comparisons between everyday life actions. So maybe, I don't know, I like to describe a quick cut as a way to crush a fly, like as if you were stomping a fly or something. But pretty much be able to describe your motion, I would say, almost implicitly. Tell your student to achieve a goal with their body instead of performing an exact motion. So I don't know, when you when you want to drink a glass of water, you're not thinking, I must move my elbows this way, my arms this way. You're just trying to do it spontaneously. And that's why you want to do that. You want a spontaneous move, because if it's spontaneous, it can be reproduced under pressure. And the last advice I would give is that don't spend too much time on this, for obvious reasons, which is when you perform, I would say, a move in maybe in a more competitive fencing context, you're still training the technical part of this move. So if I need to perform a given technique, I need, I don't know, turn your hands this way. If I perform a parry during a free sparring situation, if I perform the right technique, I will still train the moves. So don't spend too much time isolating the moves. Just make sure that the student understands the move, and once it's done, move to the next issue. So the next part is the when. So it's all about understanding the right stimulus for a given technique. So I would say it is better to use coach drills. So during a coach drill, there is, I would say, a coach and a student, and the coach will feed some actions to the student, and the student will try to react appropriately to the feed. So there were, in the previous example, like in the technical drill, I would say there is no random feed. It's really predictable. There is only one action, one feed, and you just perform the right motions according to this sequence of actions. So, one point I forgot is that you may focus on the new motions first, but you may introduce more complex patterns later. So as an example, you may start with the hand work, then you may introduce, I don't know, some footwork after, then more complex footwork, perhaps some preparatory footwork. So first you hit with the hand, then you hit with the extension of the hand and the lunge, then you hit with a step lunge. So many ways to write a sequence. So back to a coach drill. So the goal of these coach drills is to learn to recognize and answer stimuli properly. Okay? So you need to spot that something is happening and use the right answer depending on the situation. So in order to make such a drill, in order to design them properly, the whole point of the drill is to make a choice. It's all about decision making. Something is happening and I need to understand the situation and make the right choice. So the coach will be feeding some action I don't really know. I don't know the action in advance. I know it may be part of a small subset of fencing actions, but I don't know what the action will be, and I need to answer it properly. That's how the drill will work. And I would argue that you need choice, but you don't need too many choices. So I would argue it's better if you have between 2 and 4 choices. You need 2 choices because you need some form of uncertainty. You need some form of randomness. So you need, actually, you want the students to really spot what is happening, understand what is happening, and react properly. But you don't want them to be overwhelmed with the sheer amount of possibilities they may face. Okay. And obviously, the inputs fed should be, again, unambiguous. So you don't want, basically, the answer must be very clear depending on the input fed. So for beginners, at least. Obviously, for advanced students, it's another issue. You may create an ambiguous move that require ambiguous answers. So this action should be set up. You may set up the action with preparatory actions. Also, it's possible. So as an example, maybe, I don't know, you're training to make some form of thrusts, and you may, during the coach drill, you may say, okay, first I will try to perform a beat on the blade, and when there is an opening, I thrust, as an example. So you may introduce these preparatory actions first. So this is something I won't spend too much time on preparatory actions, but they're really, really important. I think you cannot teach a technique without introducing a preparatory action. This is your best bet at actually applying the historical concepts. You need to be able to set up a technique to make sure that, okay, I can apply this technique in this context and I can make this context happen using some move. And you may start introducing these preparatory actions if there's technical, if there's simple motions during coach drill. So as an example, beat as an introduction to a direct thrust, or I don't know, maybe you want something I really like is to beat thrust with a false edge from a low guard. So if you can picture it, like it's a balls tooth beat in Fiores fencing, Streichen in Lichten horse fencing, and it still exists in rapier fencing. I think there is one in Capo Ferro at the very least. So, and one way to teach that is first I teach them how to beat a static blade with a false edge, and next I teach them how to riposte very quickly from there. And I would say the next step is to set up this in a coach drill, so you can make it try to beat the blade. If you beat the blade and your point is online, you can thrust. And if you beat the blade and you end up in a low guard and the opponent if you try to beat the blade, you miss and your point ends up in a low guard, then you can perform the beat. So it's a bit of a mess, but I think you can maybe get the idea that you can introduce preparatory actions during coach drill. And one very important thing to learn during coach drill is that you also need to learn to inhibit actions. So not reacting to a fake move, to I would say a random noise. Avoiding false positives is a good thing. So not reacting may be a good choice to make in a coach drill. But it's really fencing. It's all about. It's not only being able to perform the right fencing action, but you must also make sure that this action is not too predictable. So you need to learn how to inhibit things. So the last step is the where, which is how can I create the right situation to apply this move? Okay, when I introduce a technical move. So it is, I would say, best trained with competitive games. So competitive games would be, I would say, a very constrained form of sparring. So unlike the previous exercises, be it coach drills or technical drills, both fencers should be striving to win. Like their goal is really to win the game. So the rules of the game may change, may depend on your needs, but each fencer will be trying their hardest to win. So one way to design rules for sparring games would be to restrict targets, to restrict footwork, to restrict the allowed blows, to restrict the starting guard. You need to introduce restrictions, but basically restrictions that would make that may create the right context for the concept you're currently training. So these games need an explicit scoring condition. Obviously, you need one way to win the game. So same thing as a fencing convention we described later. Also, although you may use a different convention. So as an example, my club doesn't use the afterblow rule because I don't think it fits fencing interpretation, but we do use the afterblow rule in other exercises. It may be really useful in some forms of sparring games. So when you design the rules, you may make them asymmetric and even biased. You may introduce a bias to make sure, I don't know, one issue with competitive games is that they may be very hard on beginners. So you may create a biased game that would allow beginners to perform well, I don't know, 70% of the time. So there is a rough idea is that you should fail 1/3 of the time in order to learn new things. It should be hard enough for you to fail, but easy enough for you to still perform well most of the time. If it isn't, you may need to scale back the games or use other games. But pretty much you still want the game to be competitive. You want the two fencers to be trying their best, but you can make it biased in favor of one of the two fencers. Okay? So the where is mostly a mental game. So by this point, your students should be able to perform the technique and spot the right opportunity. It's really about learning to work tactically, learning to work on your opponent in order to create an opening for your next move. So really, you need to learn to play mind games. There are a lot of mind games in fencing. I would say like half of Furious Guards, as an example, mention some forms of mind game, some form of guile, of deceiving the opponent. So once it is done, you may consider, okay, we may apply this technique in sparring. So obviously, you may argue it's still a top to bottom approach. So I would say, in the problem, I would say the main difference with the typical HEMA class would be that you choose the technique you introduce according to the needs of your students. So it's structured a bit like the usual HEMA class. It's not a problem. The main difference is that the topic of the class itself depends on the needs of your students. It will not follow the book exactly. So the other way is a tactical answer. So some people may recognize this man, which is Johan Armenberg, a famous fencing champion and writer of a very interesting book on fencing tactical analysis called Épée 2.5, Épée 2.5. I would suggest it's a very good read. And there is a big focus on a tactical answer. And the tactical answer is pretty much, you know your style, you know your strengths and weaknesses, and you want to use them the right way. So how do you train tactics? So I would say for beginners and intermediate students who don't really have a style in the first place, it's not the most obvious way to teach it. Like beginners may really be crippled by technical flaws. So introducing tactics too early, it's always a good thing to introduce tactics, but you cannot rely on tactics alone to make up for their own technical flaws. Okay, so I mean, if you can't attack properly, no amount of tactics can really save you in the midterm, I would say. Maybe you can bait another opponent during a single fencing match, but sooner or later you will fail. So you can also consider coach sparring, which is a very useful way to train tactics. So when you use coach sparring, so there are pretty much 5 people on the ring, 2 fencers, a judge, and a coach for each fencer. And the coach will be pretty much observing how his fencer play, how the way his fencers, their fencers play, and you will try to basically make comment and analyze the play style of the fencer and their opponent, and try to improvise a solution. Or pretty much, it's a very, very good lesson. So coach sparring is a really nice thing to do as a way to improve tactics, because it makes students aware of their own flaws, aware and prevents them from tilting. So they work on their mental game as well, and they can. I would say someone is performing the tactical analysis in real time for them, because it's hard to make a tactical analysis when you're actually fencing in the first place. So yeah, as I said earlier, you need to let students find their own style. Don't try to shoehorn your own approach in the mix. So maybe you like attacking better, your source likes attacking better, but your student is more defensive. And I would say there is no use in trying to shoehorn an offensive mindset. Okay, no need to. You need to work from the students. That's the point of the problem-solving approach. Start from the fight. Start from the way your students fight and work from there. So your students also must learn to plan. So one way to do that is to maybe design a sparring game where with hidden goals. So each student may choose a hidden goal. As an example, a hidden technique they want to score with, and their goal is to apply this technique. So pretty much your students need to understand that when they fence, they need to plan things in advance. They need to understand what will happen when the judge says go. Okay, you shouldn't be in. They should do more than improvise. And so, as I said earlier, being able to analyze fencing styles, the opponent or their own. And the last part is to avoid unconscious patterns, and that's where coaching is tremendously useful. So you may be performing very repetitive patterns without knowing it, and these patterns may be exploited by a cunning opponent, so you need to be aware of them. So I would say the tactical approach is harder to teach during a group class because you need a few things. Either you need a good coach or a very good tactical awareness. So it is, I would say, tactics is something you need to work on your own. You can create good tactical games. You can improvise tactics during individual lessons, but during group classes, it's a bit harder, I would say. You may work you may work on tactics, obviously, but if they do not fit a fencer's play style, I would say it's a bit sterile, I would say. Okay, if you see what I mean, it's a bit of a loss. Okay, they may learn some things, but it may not be optimal for this fencer. So I would rather use, you need a lot of coaches. If you have many, I don't know, advanced students that are ready to coach beginners or intermediate students, it's a good thing. Otherwise, it's a bit harder to set up. So the last part of this talk, and I'm done, I realize it's a bit long, is how can we design a robust, effective interpretation of a source? So I talked about a few things. The fencing convention, so what is good fencing? If you see that the fencing is not good, what should you do? You apply the problem-solving approach, you determine the problem, and you work from there. And you try to solve this problem with either the technical approach, so using basically contextualizing a technique, starting from the motions, then introducing the stimulus, then learning the right setup for the technique. Or you may introduce tactical answers. But obviously, you need to know what you will be teaching in the first place. You need to know what is the answer. I can spot a problem. It's not that hard to spot a problem. Well, it could be actually, but finding a problem is one thing and knowing the right answer is another, and it's very difficult to do. So first, I would say the idea in order to design a good interpretation is not to start from the source, but from the fight. So it's a bit counterintuitive, and obviously it only applies if you have some fighting, you need some fighting experience, and you need to know the source a little bit. But if you're, I would say, an instructor at the average HEMA club, so you still know the source, not perfectly, but you have still a rough idea of how it's meant to perform, and you need to design a class, then you shouldn't design the classes according to the structure of the source, but you should first look at your actual fencing experience. And more, if you want to design your interpretation, you want to refine it, it also applies. So first, you need to consider your own experience. You also need to watch a lot of people fence. So what you want to find is you need to look for common successful patterns. You need to spot in all these fights what is happening, what works, what are the common patterns of fencing, what are the right situations. situations that may lead to successful exchanges. So you should, this is very important, I'd say that you should ignore flashy moves. So this is a very common HEMA flow, which is to think that the point of sparring is to pull a good move. You're very happy because you perform the right technique well, and it's really nice and it looks nice. But if it's only one exchange out of 50 and the 49 other exchanges have very little to do with what you expect historical fencing to be, then there is a big issue. You need really to look for the lowest common denominator, I would say. You need to look for the average exchange. And there is a small mistake. The real question is, if you spot some successful patterns, can you find similar patterns in the sources? So it's a big difference with the usual approach, which is we will try to make a given pattern work. So I know the pattern first, I extract it from the sources, and I refine the pattern in, I would say, a successful way. And the next step, here we do differently. We go the other way around. So here is a successful pattern. Does it match? An historical source? Does it match the fencing treatise I study? In order to perform this, you need to be really honest. You cannot lie to yourself. You need to look at your fencing objectively, even if it doesn't match the way you would like it to be. Like the very, very common example, I guess most long-sword fencers here expect it, is that if you teach passing steps, but so passing steps means stepping with the leg that is backward. But when you fence, you don't use them at all, then there is an issue with the interpretation. Obviously, there is a problem somewhere. It may be a problem with the fencing convention. It may be a problem with your interpretation. It may be a problem with your training, but you cannot ignore it. Okay, you cannot say that, okay, I perform a very nice move once in a while, so my interpretation is working fine. Another thing to avoid is that to being too proud of your own interpretation. And by that, I mean thinking that, okay, I can't apply this interpretation, but it's right. I know it is right. My interpretation is right. It's just that we cannot apply it yet. We're not good enough to apply it. And I would consider that some form of HEMA hubris, I would say, in that we consider as HEMA fencer that having good interpretations is just as important as fencing well. One way or another, we may even implicitly think that. And so it's hard to let go of a bad interpretation, but we should be able to do that. So once you found a successful pattern and you spot, let's say you apply this successful pattern to a historical technique, then you may try new patterns. You may experiment these new patterns in your own sparring. And what is very useful is to refine existing patterns into historical techniques. So if you realize that your students are not applying historical techniques, but they're doing something that is very close and that works well enough, then you may try to refine this pattern into something that is not only more historical, but may work better as well. As an example, if you realize that your student like blocking cuts, but you consider that in your source it is better to counter cut. So it's better to counter a cut with a cut than with a static block. Then the right intuition is not to shoehorn counter cutting into their sparring. You shouldn't force them to counter cut, but maybe you should teach them a way to block, a way to parry that is more historical. So I don't know, if you're doing Fiore, you may use the middle, I don't know, posta frontale, or maybe the middle cuts. Or if you're doing Lichtenauer, you may use winding instead of whatever parry they use, but you should still keep You should only refine an existing pattern to make it tighter, to make it more historical, and to make it more efficient. You may also consider drills as some forms of snapshots of a fight. So if you consider a recurring situation, then you may somehow isolate the situation. You may work on a few, maybe something that is only a few seconds of a fight, but very important part, and you may focus on this snapshot and simulate this snapshot. It does not need to look like a real sparring. It may be, I don't know, a very simple blade actions or a couple of blade actions, like, I don't know, one I beat, someone beats my blade, I disengage, I thrust, this kind of exchanges, or even preparatory footwork. So very short snapshots, but you may drill the snapshots by isolating the right moves and the right concepts during the snapshots. You also need to keep feedback loops, so that's why you need to spar. You need to judge your sparring, you need to record your sparring, and you need to update your interpretation according to the feedback brought by the sparring and brought by your own classes. So you may be wrong and it's not an issue, but you need to be able to register this feedback. Another way to consider this feedback is that pretty much keep observing your students so you can deal with the next problem properly. So that's why you need a dynamic curriculum. There cannot be a problem-solving approach with a static curriculum, because you need to solve the problems your students must deal with. So you don't know what the next problem will be. So you should be able to design a class depending on the whatever issue may come your way. So as an example, my own example, I told my students to attack, and the next step was obviously to tell them to parry. And I realized that their parry, they would end up very close after parrying a blow. So it was kind of an issue for me, because I expected to teach them like blade riposte with the blade. But finally, rather than changing the parry and running them to void and change the distance and make them prepare their blow from afar, that would be very long. I just taught them a few close plays, or a few resting plays, a few very simple riposte from the close play, in order to allow them to riposte after the simple parries allowed. So this way, they can apply these techniques, they can apply these Fiore plays to their own sparring very quickly and very efficiently. You can integrate them very fast. So I did not expect to teach stretto, yogo stretto, so the close play, that early, but I did it anyway. Okay, so that's all, folks. Thank you for listening to this pretty long talk. So the point of my talk was to pretty much make us rethink the relationship between a modern practice of HEMA, or modern fencing practice, and the source, to make it more spontaneous and more lively. So to make a short summary, how can we do that? First, design the fencing convention, define what is good fencing according to your own understanding and the sources, the historical sources themselves. So be able to judge and assess this good fencing. So define good fencing objectively. Then start from the fight. So observe the way people fight, or think what would be the next logical move in a fight. I don't know, if I teach the attack first, then teaching the parry next would make sense, as an example. But basically, you need to solve problems. So what is the next problem I should solve? You can either observe your students, or if they're not sparring yet, you can determine it logically. And once you solve this problem, you go to the next problem. So in order to solve the problem, it can be done with techniques or with tactics. And in order to define the right techniques and right tactics, you need to observe fights. So you need to watch a lot of fights, find the right patterns, apply these patterns to the sources. So what are the most successful patterns, and do they fit some historical moves? So And next, learn to train these patterns by designing these patterns around the way, by introducing these patterns as a form of refinement. So refine the way your students find in order to apply these patterns. So I think this way you may have a good start to build your own curriculum. So thank you for your attention, and thanks for listening.